Welcome to the Synthesis of Yoga, the book that changed my life. For those who are new, we are studying in depth Sri Aurobindo's The Synthesis of Yoga. And we have reached the part 1, 8th chapter. We have just completed the 7th chapter of the part 1, the codes of conduct. And in that, we have seen 4 different stages of human codes of conduct and its evolution. Starting with first, the human individual needs and desires. That's superseded by the collectivity and its needs. Then it gets superseded by the ethical rules, internal law of the individual, as the individualism begins. And at that point, individual finds the social law binding and suffocating, and there is a revolt of the individual. So that individualism contains in it that emergence of the individual soul, but it is still bound by the morality and ethical conducts. These are generated by the mind, and it has its limitation because mind is an instrument of partial limited truth. Therefore, whatever rules and regulations it comes up with, codes of conduct it comes up with, it will be limited. Therefore, the need to reach the 4th stage, where it is entering into spiritual and supramental stage, where entering into the divine knowledge and will with a tremendous plasticity and freedom. And that's the stage of conduct that is required in order to establish a Satya Yuga, age of truth, in a social evolution. So that is what we have covered in our last chapter. That was ending with episode 101. Now we are starting episode 102. And we are taking up the chapter, the Supreme Will, which will continue and look at this social evolution from the perspective of the will, the Supreme Will. And we have the link to this chapter in the description. I would highly encourage all those who are new to follow the text, because we are reading line by line, and there is a great advantage of getting into the way Sri Aurobindo sees the yogic consciousness of the master and its patterns. We are internalizing those patterns by reading his lines and diving deep into it. That imprints the patterns and reformats our mind, which will eventually enable us to see from that broad, integral perspective. So with that, let's begin this new chapter, the Supreme Will. In the light of this progressive manifestation of the Spirit, progressive manifestation of the Spirit, that is the key phrase here. The Spirit is progressively manifesting in this material world and revealing itself. And that's the significance of evolution. Evolution of consciousness here on our material earth. In the light of this progressive manifestation of the Spirit, first apparently bound in the ignorance, the Spirit appears to be apparently bound in ignorance. We are seeing it from the human perspective. From a human perspective, there is this perception and experience of an apparently bound condition of the Spirit in ignorance, avidya. It's bound there, and it is operating within the conditions of the ignorance. Then free in the power and wisdom of the infinite. So it starts from that apparently bound conditions of the ignorance, and then it enters into the free it is free in the power and wisdom of the infinite. One is the bound condition of the finite, other is the unbound condition of the infinite. Then free in the power and wisdom of the infinite, we can better understand the great and crowning injunction of the Gita to the karma yogin. The great and crowning injunction of the Gita to the karma yogin. So Gita, our most authoritative text on karma yoga, and it has a crowning injunction that says, abandoning all dharmas, all principles and all laws and rules of conduct, take refuge in me alone. This is the line from Sri Krishna to Arjuna after having taught a full range of beautiful clarity. The final message is, abandoning all dharmas, all principles and all laws and all rules of conduct, take refuge in me alone. Take refuge in the divine. So in the last chapter, we saw the codes of conduct and its evolution. And that evolution from the individual to the collectivity, to the mental stage, to the morality, from there it enters to the spiritual domain. That's where this becomes the key stone. Abandoning all dharmas, all principles and laws and rules of conduct, because all principles and laws and rules of conduct belongs to the mental domain. Take refuge in me alone, in the divine. Divine guidance, divine will, divine ananda of action. Take refuge in that. That's the ultimate place to reach. Let's read this line. In the light of this progressive manifestation of the Spirit. So we need to also see progressive manifestation even from the perspective of codes of conduct evolving through its 4 stages. Progressive manifestation of the Spirit, first apparently bound in the ignorance, then free in the power and wisdom of the Spirit, we can better understand the great and crowning injunction of the Gita to the karma yogin. Abandoning all dharmas, all principles and all laws and rules of conduct, take refuge in me alone. So that's where Gita is inviting. Abandoning everything, take refuge. All standards and rules are temporary constructions. This is what we have found in the last chapter. Whatever rules and regulations we come up with in a society, they are all temporary constructions. So the tendency to make our social laws and rules into absolute certainties and rigid formations, that prevents a society from progressing, that prevents an individual from going beyond them. So we need to remember this consistently, persistently, repeatedly, that all standards and rules are temporary constructions founded upon the needs of the ego in its transition from matter to spirit. So the ego is transitioning from matter to spirit. Ego finds itself, the individual finds itself emerging within the ignorance, bound by the material life, in which the formation of the ego is the first stage. And then from there, ego transcends itself and enters the domain of the spirit. That is the evolution of consciousness. So all standards and rules are temporary constructions founded upon the needs of the ego in its transition from matter to spirit. These makeshifts have their relative imperativeness so long as we rest satisfied in the stages of transition. These are makeshift rules, codes of conduct. Yet, they have a relative imperativeness so long as we rest satisfied in the stages of transition. we do have stages to the ascension into higher levels. So in every stage, there is an appropriate code of conduct, laws that govern our actions. When we go to an organization, every organization will have its policy, rules, codes of conduct. And we are voluntarily, consciously choosing to be within that framework. And to be in that framework is to also voluntarily accept those codes of conduct. We cannot say, look, I'm a free individual, I want to be in your organization, but I want to follow my own rules. It won't work. If you want to be part of the collectivity, that collectivity will have its codes of conduct. And it has its imperativeness. It has its necessity in that context. And if we are in that stage, we need to also honor it. So to make these makeshifts have a relative imperativeness so long as we rest satisfied in the stages of transition, attached to the mental movements, or even fixed in the ranges of the mental plane that are touched by the spiritual lusters. So as long as we are living in the mind and mental consciousness, we do create rules, regulations, codes of conduct. And that is inevitable because the mental perspective is limited, and the way the mind conducts its affairs is by creating rules, regulations, standards of conduct. It standardizes behavior and demands everyone to follow. Even when a mind is touched by illuminations of the spiritual range beyond its currently established possibilities. So even when there is an illumination, the lusters of the spiritual domains above illumines the mind. Mind would still translate and convert that into moral codes of conduct, ethical codes of conduct, rules, standardized regulatory policies, principles. This is how the mind works. And as long as we live in the mind, that's inevitable. And it is something that gives structure and form to things in the mental world. Mind organizes. It's a great organizer. It structures. So it is inevitable as long as we are living satisfied with the mental range of our being. These makeshifts have a relative imperativeness so long as we rest satisfied in the stages of transition from the human needs and desires to social rules of conduct to ethical codes of conduct. Within that range, this is inevitable imperative. Content with the physical and vital life attached to the mental movement, or even fixed in the ranges of the mental plane that are touched by the spiritual lusters. So this is what happens to many spiritual teachers who do get an illumination into a higher range of consciousness. And we have historically the prophets and great teachers who had an access to a higher range. But that illumination translates itself into mind. And the mind will reduce it into codes of conduct, standardized codes of conduct that everyone must follow. That's where it mechanizes, make things rigid. But it is nature of the mind, even when it is touched by the spiritual light. So even fixed in the ranges of the mental plane that are touched by the spiritual lusters. But beyond is the unwalled wideness of a supramental infinite consciousness, and there all temporary structures cease. So these mental temporary structures will cease only when we ascend beyond the mind into the supramental ranges of consciousness, which is infinite in its nature. So, but beyond is the unwalled wideness. Unwalled wideness. Our human consciousness is very bound. First of all, we have this experience of being bound by the body consciousness. We find ourselves living inside a body. Inside that, there is our mind emerging, and in a very limited memory of this particular birth and its limited sensory range. So there is a bound consciousness. It's walled in within body and mental consciousness. Whereas supramental consciousness is unwalled wideness. Beyond is the unwalled wideness of a supramental infinite consciousness, and there all temporary structures cease. So it is when we unpack our bound nature, enter into unwalled wideness. It is in that space of infinite consciousness, all the temporary structures erected by the mind will cease. It is not possible to enter utterly into the spiritual truth of the eternal and infinite if we have not the faith and courage to trust ourselves into the hands of the Lord of all things and the friend of all creatures, and leave utterly behind us our mental limits and measures. So, in order to enter that space of infinite freedom, we need faith and courage, and to give ourselves into the hands of the Lord of all things and friend of all creatures. The divine is a friend of all creatures. There is a wisdom and love, a motherly wisdom that guides, nurtures, leads. It's not the God who sits and punishes for your bad deeds. It is a profound wisdom, a mother guiding, nourishing, nurturing. On one hand, the Lord presiding over all things. On the other side is the friend of all creatures. That's how we need to conceive the supreme. In this chapter, we are diving deeper into the supreme will of the Lord. But this Lord is not a punishing God, but a friend. That friend is always there. So it is not possible to enter utterly into the spiritual truth of the eternal and infinite if we have not the faith and courage to trust ourselves into the hands of the Lord of all things, because we have to give ourselves, as the Gita says, abandon all dharmas and take refuge. If we are to take refuge, leaving behind our standards of conduct that we have evolved across centuries through social evolution, when we are to leave them behind, we need courage, we need faith in the Lord and the friend of all things, who is the one who will give us the greater light, flexibility. To trust ourselves into the hands of the Lord of all things and the friend of all creatures, and leave utterly behind our mental limits and measures. Mental limits and measures. Mind is measuring all the time, even if it is a scientific measurement, measuring the material processes. Even that measure is limited, because it is a limited view of the mind. Behind all that is the one consciousness, one being, one existence, friend of all things, into whom we give ourselves, abandon ourselves into that hands. It is not possible to enter utterly into the spiritual truth of the eternal and the infinite if we have not the faith and courage to trust ourselves into the hands of the Lord of all things and the friend of all creatures, and leave utterly behind us our mental limits and measures. At one moment, we must plunge without hesitation, reserve, fear, or scruple into the ocean of the free, the infinite, the absolute. So time comes in our ascension, in our journey of evolution of consciousness, the yogic growth of consciousness, time comes. At one moment we must plunge without hesitation, because we doubt. Mind will come and doubt. How will I decide what is the right course of action if I leave behind codes of conduct? So doubt comes, hesitation, reserve, fear or scruple into the ocean of the free, the infinite, the absolute. That's the nature of the divine consciousness. It's free, it's infinite, it is absolute. After the law, liberty, there is our moral codes of conduct and the laws. Beyond that comes liberty of the spirit. After the personal, after the general, after the universal standards, there is something greater. The impersonal plasticity, the divine freedom, the transcendent force, and the supernal impulse. After the straight path of the ascent, the wide plateaus of the summit. It's a broad picture Sri Aurobindo is giving. After the straight path of the ascent, straight path. In the Vedas always there is the reference, help us to move from the crooked path to the straight path. Lower nature's movements are long winding spirals of crooked, dispersive, wasteful journey. Whereas the path of yoga is straight. And as we ascend plateau after plateau, levels of consciousness one after other, into the higher spiritual ranges, then eventually we enter the wide plateaus of the summit. So after the law, liberty. After personal, after general, after the universal standards. So there is a personal standard of the individual. And there is a general standard of the collectivity. And beyond that, there is a universal standards. All these were our scaffoldings on the way. There is something greater. The impersonal plasticity. Incredible flexibility in our codes of conduct, flexibility, freedom to decide what to do, what not to do. Not bound by rigid rules. Impersonal plasticity, the divine freedom, the transcendent force, and the supernal impulse. A force that is transcendent. It is beyond our individuality, beyond this manifest world. Something transcendent enters into the mold of the instrument and works through the instrument, expresses through the instrument, and enter a supernal impulse, a divine impulsion that enters. After the straight paths of the ascent, the wide plateaus of the summit. That is the unwalled wideness. We enter into an unwalled wideness. The Vedas always use the reference of climbing the mountain ranges, one after other, plateau after plateau, and reaching the wide plateau and the oceans of infinite wideness, unwalled wideness. That's what we will discover in our journey. There are 3 stages of the ascent. In our previous chapter, we saw the 4 stages of codes of conduct itself evolving. Here he is bringing in the 3 stages of the ascent. At the bottom, the bodily life, enslaved to the pressure of necessity and desire. That's that first stage of code of conduct, has that bodily life and its needs and desires. Bodily life. So body has its needs. Food, for example, is a need. Sleep, for example, is a need. So needs are there for the body. It has to be fulfilled. But the needs get mixed with desires. For example, food is a need. Now, when you're eating food, you can eat food in so many different ways, where we bring in increasing sophistication and desires into it. The way the food is served, where you eat, the comfort, the flavor, the whole range of, for example, eating in a 5-star hotel. That's refining of the senses, part of our desires, like refining sensory experience. Food is food, basic food. And that can have a full range of very basic meal that fulfills the bodily needs, material needs, energy needs. But it can mix with so many other dimensions of our life. One is this need for pleasure of our senses. Other is social status, bonding, relationship. The whole range come into the very act of eating. So there is a whole dimensions of desires that are added layer after layer into the basic needs. So we have at the bottom the bodily life, enslaved to the pressure of necessity and desire. Pressure of necessity. Food is a necessity. Sleep is a necessity. We can sleep. Now, sleep can be different types of bed and different types of home environment, with fan, without fan, with AC, without AC, natural ventilation, all kinds of things. The kind of bedding, the bed sheet, the pillows, the whole range comes, comfort dimension come. That's where the desires come into picture. On one hand, there's a necessity of sleep, then there is a layers of desires that creates this your particular way of eating, sleeping. It's a combination of necessity and desires. So at the bottom, the bodily life enslaved to the pressure of necessity and desire. In the middle, the mental, higher emotional and psychic rule that feels after great interest, aspirations, experiences. So that's the middle ground. From the simple, vital physical existence of bodily life, the next is the mental life, where we have higher emotional and psychic rule also come into the picture. That's the middle ground. That feels after greater interests, aspirations, and experiences. So the mind, naturally open to beautiful philosophy and aspiring for a greater perfection, brings in a greater ordering, a philosophical perspective into our life. That's the second stage. We studied this in the introduction to synthesis of yoga, 3 steps of nature. So there is a bodily life, then the mental life, beyond that is the spiritual. So Sri Aurobindo is bringing back that pattern. There is a bodily life, that's where the necessities and desires rule. And that's where the first 2 stages of social codes of conduct, where first is governed by the individual's needs and desires, then it comes under the pressure of the social needs, and these are still within the boundary of our vital physical existence. Then comes the mental stage, where morality, ethics are layered into it. Philosophy come into picture, where an internal law begins to govern the individual. So that's the second stage. Middle, the mental, higher emotional and psychic rule that feels after great interests, aspirations, experiences. At the summits, first a deeper psychic and spiritual state. So when we go beyond the mind, at the summit, first is a deeper psychic and spiritual state. So there is the psychic reality inside us, the soul's reality. We have our initial contact with the psychic being, and there is an opening upward into the spiritual ranges above. And the more we ascend and connect with the higher, we also go deeper into the psychic. So there is a discovery that happens with the deeper psychic and spiritual state. They go hand in hand. Deeper we go into the soul, and higher we climb into the spiritual ranges above. So at the summits, first a deeper psychic and spiritual state, and then a supramental, eternal consciousness in which all our aspirations and seekings discover their own infinite significance. So after this deeper psychic and spiritual states, finally we reach the higher plateau of the supramental consciousness. That is where we discover the eternal consciousness in which all our aspirations and seekings. In our ordinary state, we do have aspirations, we do have seekings, but they are distorted, limited, narrow. And this very same aspiration for harmony in the society, love in relationship, perfection in our work and society, all that finds its fullness only when we touch upon the supramental range of consciousness. Let's read this line fully. There are 3 stages of the ascent. At the bottom, the bodily life, enslaved to the pressure of necessity and desire. In the middle, the mental, higher emotional, and psychic rule that feels after greater interests, aspirations, experiences. At the summits, first a greater psychic and spiritual state, and then a supramental, eternal consciousness in which all our aspirations and seekings discover their own intimate significance. So the true significance eventually gets discovered as we ascend to the highest possible plateau of unwalled wideness. In the bodily life, first desire and need, and then practical good of the individual and society are the governing consideration, the dominant force. So this is what we have covered in the previous chapter, the first 2 stages of the codes of conduct. First is born out of our individual's desire and need, and the individual ego demanding its own fulfillment. But it will soon come under the pressure of the collectivity in which it is part, and the collectivity puts its pressure. So the individual and collectivity come together in that space of these 2 layers. First is the individual needs and desires, second is the collectivity's needs and desires. Together they form the composition. In the bodily life, first desire and need, and then the practical good of the individual and the society, the practical good of the individual and the society. Social codes of conduct are based on the practicality of a given society. These are the governing consideration, the dominant force. In the mental life, ideals rule. So when we go beyond this first bodily life stage, the mental stage starts. So Sri Aurobindo is reiterating what he has already covered. Here he is capturing that essential understanding once again. In the mental life, ideas and ideals rule. Whereas in the first stage, it is not ideas and ideals, but desires and needs, bodily needs, vital needs. These rule. Whereas when it comes to the mind, we enter into the world of pure ideas and ideals. Ideas that are half lights wearing the garb of truth. That's their limitation because of the nature of the mind. They are half lights wearing the garb of truth. The way the mind conceives ideas, receive ideas, it is half truth. It is only a garb of truth, only a half light. Ideals formed by the mind as a result of a growing but still imperfect intuition and experience. So the evolving soul is using its mind and learning to understand its environment, mastering the environment, and there is a growing intuition and experience. But it is a growing intuition and experience, not a perfect intuition and experience. Therefore, there is a partial light and a half truth. And it is with that partial light and truth, it forms a mental ideal. So great philosophers come up with their philosophies, which is nothing but a reflection in the mind of a greater truth but a limited partial truth. That's why the philosophy of communism, which looked only upon the economic life of man, and that was kept as the central reference for the social development. Though it has an element of truth in it, it is only a partial truth of the human nature. It is not economics alone that drives human aspiration. Rather, that economic part is early stage of a rudimentary growth. Deeper aspiration, soul's aspiration, goes beyond all that, which is not touched by many philosophies. Therefore, the philosophical framework they come up with cannot run for a long time because of the limitation, half-truth, reflected, narrow, limited light. In the mental life, ideas and ideals rule. Ideas that are half-lights wearing the garb of truth. Ideals formed by the mind as a result of a growing but still imperfect intuition and experience. There is an intuition but imperfect. There is experience but limited. Whenever the mental life prevails, the bodily diminishes. It's a brute insistence. Now, this is what culture brings. Mind, as it develops, it creates its art and culture. And its very role is to refine the brute animal. And as a result, there is a refinement, and this insistence of the bodily necessities and drives and compulsions gets refined and refined and refined. So whenever the mental life prevails, the bodily diminishes. It's a brute insistence. So the one who has a highly developed mind, it's very natural for them to forget to eat food on time, because that's not their most pressing need. They can easily forget to sleep. They can go on studying because their mind is finding joy in the world of ideas. So food, sleep, all this gets a secondary stage. That's what happens when the mental development picks up. Whenever the mental life prevails and the bodily diminishes its brute insistence, man, the mental being, feels pushed by the urge of mental nature, to mold, in the sense of the idea or the ideal, the life of the individual. So, as this mental life deepens, it begins to govern the individual. You are able to override the bodily needs, necessities, desires, refine them, purify them, and mold our life according to the mental ideals, mental values, principles. Therefore, ideals like ahimsa, the non-violence, or its contemporary manifestation, the veganism, it's a mental principle of compassion to the animals, compassion to the world, brought into the eating habits. So we begin to mold our behavior based on a mental principle ideal. Mold in the sense of the idea or the ideal, the life of the individual. And in the end, even the vaguer, more complex life of the society is forced to undergo this subtle process. So it starts with the individual. An individual who finds an ideal, the right thing to follow, and apply it in one's life, slowly influencing other individuals of the society and spreading the idea, the ideal across the society, and compelling the whole society to shift its behavior, to become, for example, a vegetarian country, a vegetarian society. Things like that are part of such mental molding the bodily needs, desires. Whenever the mental life prevails and the bodily life diminishes its brute insistence, man, the mental being, feels pushed by the urge of the mental nature to mold in the sense of the idea, molding individual life in the sense of the idea, or the ideal, the life of the individual, and in the end, even the vaguer, more complex life of the society. Because the life of the society is far more complex and vague than the life of the individual that is constituting the society. So there is a complexity, a vague complexity of society, and that is forced into the mold of the ideal. In the end, even the vaguer, more complex life of the society is forced to undergo this subtle process. And we see increasingly modern society getting governed by many of these emerging ideals, principles. In the spiritual life, or when a higher power than mind has manifested and taken possession of the nature, these limited motive forces recede, dwindle, tend to disappear. So such a mental policy, mental principle, mental codes of conduct, molding, these tendencies would disappear only when it is replaced by a higher consciousness that enters and replaces the mental way of functioning. But we are human beings. We know only how to function from the mind and mental consciousness. So it is exceptionally rare individuals who learn to go beyond the normal ranges of the mind to enter into the spiritual, and they go beyond the regular social norms. So in the spiritual life, or when a higher power than the mind has manifested and taken possession of nature, it's not enough to get a glimpse, it has manifested and taken possession of the nature of the individual. Then these limited motive forces recede. Motive forces of the mind and its ideal, or in its preceding range, is the brute animal necessities and desires. All that gets overwritten. The limited motive forces recede, dwindle, tend to disappear. So there is a gradual dwindling and disappearance of the old ways of being. But it can happen only under the conditions of a spiritual range of consciousness that is beyond mind, manifest and take possession of the full instrument. The spiritual or supramental self, the divine being, the supreme and immanent reality. So he is touching upon different aspects of the higher. The spiritual or supramental self, that's above our human consciousness. The divine being, Sat, above, the supreme. And the immanent reality, immanent. In this material world, there is an involved divine consciousness, immanent in it, and upholding it from below. That reality itself, all three we have to see. The immanent reality, the supramental self, the divine being, the supreme above. So the supramental self, the divine being, the immanent reality, all these are to be seen together. Must be alone the Lord within us. This chapter is about the supreme will. So here is the Lord. And this Lord is here immanent, who is also transcendent as well as universal. The supramental self, the divine being, the immanent reality, that is the supreme. The spiritual or supramental self, the divine being, the supreme and immanent reality, must be alone the Lord within us, and share freely our final development according to the highest, widest, most integral expression possible to the law of our nature. Our individual has a material mold, and there is a law of its nature, and its involved divinity in it, within the possibilities it is working through. So it is within that range, this supreme divine consciousness works its way through. Shape freely our final development. This greater consciousness will shape, and it will shape freely. It will not shape us through the laws, the rules that we, the mental being, would expect it to do. No, that is not how the divine consciousness would work. It's systematic, not in the mental sense, but in a divine perspective. It works through you. Shape freely our final development according to the highest, widest, most integral expression. Integral expression. That means it is through and through the mental range, vital range, physical range. Everything is taken up. It's integrally transformed. It is not transforming just a part of the being, but totality of the being, all the layers. Therefore, an integral expression, possible of the law of our nature. Our current nature, it is the law of our nature. Within that, there are possibilities. Within that possibilities, this divine consciousness would enter and freely shape. The spiritual or supramental self, the divine being, the supreme and immanent reality, must be alone the Lord within us and shape freely our final development according to the highest, widest, most integral expression possible to the law of our nature. In the end, that nature acts in the perfect truth and its spontaneous freedom. So eventually the divine will, divine consciousness that acts, in the end, that nature acts, that higher nature, the divine consciousness acts in the perfect truth, T capital. It is the absolute truth here. The perfect truth and its spontaneous freedom. A freedom that is moment to moment spontaneous. For it obeys only the luminous power of the eternal. This will, it obeys only the luminous power of the eternal. Luminous. It is coming from that divine light of the eternal. The individual has nothing further to gain, no desire to fulfill. It is such an individual. We see many great masters saying there is nothing more to do. This doesn't mean that there is no action taking place through them. It means the divine will has taken full possession of them. There is no separate individual will who is saying, I have this or that to do. But the divine will has taken possession of the instrument and uses the instrument for its work in the world. A world that is undergoing an evolutionary transformation, of which a great master becomes the vehicle, a transmission point for the great higher consciousness. And for that particular individual, it is like, look, there is no action. I am not doing anything. It is all getting done by a greater consciousness. It is that which is doing. The divine will is doing, not me. I am empty, vast, free. The individual has nothing further to gain, no desire to fulfill, because the individual is no more driven by any desire. Everything is vanished. You become a free, vast space into which the divine light and force can pour in, flow out, ripple into the world. He has become a portion of the impersonality or the universal personality of the eternal. So such an individual becomes a portion of the impersonality. a portion of the impersonality. So when that experience dominates, that is where you see many masters saying there is no individual at all. Even many would go, there is no self in the sense of the individual self. It is dissolved. In the sense of the mental self, the ego self, that's dissolved. What is left is a vast, universal, empty impersonality acting. Or there is another experience, or the universal personality of the eternal. That's another experience to which many masters go. And that's where they discover the Supreme Lord acting through them, whether it is brought forth in the name of Sri Krishna, Shiva, whatever be the vocabulary they would use. There is a universal personality of the divine. All are equally true. And it is childish when people fight saying this is superior or that is superior. All these are possible types of experience when we go beyond our individuality. We can enter into a vast impersonality, we can enter into a universal personality. All these are possibilities for our ascension and experience. The individual has nothing further to gain, no desire to fulfill. He has become a portion of the impersonality or the universal personality of the eternal. No other object than the manifestation and play of the divine spirit in life. So the only object for such an individual is to let that divine consciousness and its manifestation and play of the divine spirit in life, the individual become the instrumental condition through which the divine plays in the world with humanity. The manifestation and play of the spirit in life, divine spirit in life, and the maintenance and the conduct of the world's order and its evolutionary progression is supported by such individuals who has transcended their individuality, merged into the impersonal or the universal person. And they become the transmission points through which the divine conducts, manages the world. The maintenance and conduct of the world. In its march towards the divine goal can move him to action. So that's what mobilizes a liberated individual established in this freedom. Get into action. Because there is that vast will of the divine mobilizing this individual, whether to sit or to walk, engage with life, whatever be the mode of operation chosen by the divine will, so it will be the action of that individual. We cannot create a rule saying that this is how a liberated individual, an established individual in that higher consciousness must act. That's a tendency of our mental consciousness. It is the divine consciousness and that will decides what type of work can be done by an individual. Whether to keep the individual in a single location without going anywhere, or take that body, move it around the planet and create ripples. Everything is possible for the divine will. The supreme will decides what to do, and you don't intervene into it. Once your mind is dissolved, the ego is dissolved, you are fully in the hands of the Lord, the friend of all creatures. So, no other object than the manifestation and play of the divine spirit in life and the maintenance and conduct of the world in its march towards the divine goal can move him to action. So, only the divine will move him into action. Mental ideas, opinions, constructions are his no more. So, even when such an individual is giving, for example, a philosophical articulation, It is not his. It comes through him. He is only a vehicle, a spokesperson, but the divine speaks through him. Mental ideas, opinions, constructions are his no more, for his mind has fallen into silence. It is only a channel for the light and truth of the divine knowledge. Light and truth of the divine knowledge. So the greater light and force and its truth enters into the individual, manifest as thought, as speech, as action. And this individual is absolutely free. He's not the doer. Action happens through such an individual. There is no laboring mind, constructing ideas, building up mental structures, nothing. It is a free vastness, an infinite plasticity, where a greater light and its truth freely expresses. It will have its mental structure. It uses the mind depending upon the social context in which it is operating. So it will articulate according to social context, the language available, concepts that are available, so that people can have access to it. It is contextualized. The divine contextualizes into what is existing in the world so that it can gradually reveal and push the individuals and the society towards a greater revelation of the spirit. Ideals are too narrow for the vastness of his spirit. It is the ocean of the infinite that flows through him and moves him forever. So the ideals, as the mind, a philosophical mind would construct, these are too narrow for a liberated being who is living beyond the mind in a greater light, in a greater truth. Such an individual will not be using any of this philosophy, though such an individual can perfectly express itself in terms of philosophy. But it's not bound by philosophy. It is not philosophy born out of a mental construction, but it is a vision seen, a light and truth revealing itself through the mind of the individual, freely shaping the substance of the mind according to the social context in which that particular individual is living, particular age and its language, its customs. Into that context, the light and truth will mold, express through this individual. But such an individual is just a passive medium. Ideals are too narrow for the vastness of his spirit. It is the one ocean of the infinite, one ocean of the infinite that flows through him and moves him forever. That is the Sthita Prajna. You have become the ocean into which all the rivers are pouring in from all sides, but you are Achala Pratishtam, immobile, vast, free. And there is action happening, but it is not you who are acting. Action is just flowing through you. It is the divine, supreme will flowing through you. That's the condition of the supreme will and its action. So we go through these stages of ascension. First stage is bodily life, then the mental life, then the spiritual life. And in this, the first stage, bodily life, has the two parts. The individual ego and its self-assertion, which gets modified by the social good, practical good of the society. So these two are part of the first stage. Then comes the morality and codes of conduct through the mental stage of life. Then dissolving all that, entering into the freedom of the supreme will. Thus, we progress stage by stage towards greater and greater freedom. And its truth, light, and delight. So with that, we end this episode 102. Looking forward to hear from you, your observations, insights, and Please do subscribe to the channel if you have not yet, so that you can get notifications. Also, make sure you click the bell icon so that you do get the notification in your mailbox. See you next episode. Thank you.